foothills of the Sierra Nevada. A new hero will emerge. One who is ready. One who makes sure their friends and family are set. And has the power to go at a moment's notice. This fire season, you're the hero. We are Ready Nevada County.
Nevada County has a new tool to make evacuations safer and more efficient in the event of an emergency. This new tool is called Zone Haven, and we need you to know your zone.
In order to know your zone, you need to go to community.zonehaven.com, type in your address. Once your address populates in the pop-up window, take that information and write down the zone that is given to you where you know you'll find it in case of emergency.
Zone Haven and knowing your zone does not replace Nixle and/or Code Red. It actually supplements them, and it makes those tools more powerful because you'll know what zones are being evacuated or which ones are being placed on advisory. And as a result, you won't have to do anything else other than listen to those messages and know if it's time to go.
Even if you don't have internet, this could be done by word of mouth, it can be done by radio, or it could be us driving down the street, so please know your zone.
From Truckee to Lake of the Pines, from Chicago Park to Spenceville. Every single square mile of Nevada County has a zone. And having a zone that you know for your neighborhood is going to help you save time to be able to evacuate and keep you and your family safe.
Ready Nevada County is an education campaign designed to help the public have successful outcomes during emergency events. We really focus on a whole host of disasters or emergency events. We want to have a broad spectrum. We want to be prepared for anything, but really we focus a lot on wildfire because we know that's one of the most likely events to happen in Nevada County.
Ready, Set, Go is really built around the wildfire premise to prepare residents to be ready before an event, to move into the set posture when there's a red flag or a fire is near you, and then to go when it's time to go.
Essentially, in its simplest form, it's a three-tiered community emergency preparedness plan.
I have lived in this house, which we built, my husband and I, 26 years ago now, actually. We selected the hardy plank, the concrete siding, and also the metal roof. Then when we moved up here and heard about the 49er fire, that's when we started to say, wow, this really is even more important than we first realized.
So the 49er fire is one of the most historic fires in Nevada County's history. They figured it changed the laws of the state of California that said this is how you have to protect your home. That came out of Nevada County.
Steve Eubanks came from the Fire Safe Council, and the main thing we needed to pay attention to was the ladder fuels. Planting has been removed from the edges of the house so that it does not touch the house. It was an incredible service from the Fire Safe Council to come out and spend a couple of hours going through this property
So the ready phase is when there's no immediate threat to you and your family. This is the time when you should be doing education and planning, whether that be training, educating yourself, or accumulating equipment, hardening your home, creating defensible space.
Defensible space is really all about creating a buffer zone between your house and flammable vegetation. We really focus on defensible space around the home, that first 100 feet, but also around the roadway too. Another aspect of the ready phase is hardening the home, and really what that means is making your home more resilient to wildfire.
That's going to be putting the fine-grained mesh around the vents of your home so that embers won't get under your house or into the eaves of your house. That's going to be using non-combustible materials on your deck and around your home. So when an ember storm comes through, it's not going to ignite your home itself.
I currently live here in Grass Valley with my parents. All of us have sleep apnea, so we all have CPAP machines that require power in order to run.
I also use a nebulizer, and that's
turn mics on. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the June 22nd regular meeting of the Nevada County Planning Commission, and we're going to start with a salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Tyler, you call the roll?
Yes, Madam Chair. Commissioner McAteer?
Present.
Commissioner Millman? Commissioner Millman?
Here.
Acting Chair Duncan?
Here.
For the record, please note that Commissioner Mastrodonato and Chair Greeno are absent.
Yeah, it's becoming a habit of those two, it seems. We'll see if there's a trend happening. Any corrections to the agenda?
No corrections.
Okay. The next item is public comment. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience who wants to address the commission on an item that is not on the agenda. See no one rushing forward. We'll close that, and there is no commission business. Next item is consent calendar. We've got two items, development reviews. Do I have a motion to approve?
I'll move the consent items.
I'll second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right, motion carries.
I will say to Mr. Casano, who's here, just please lend my thanks to Mr. Amaral and all for the work of the cleanup up there in Deer Creek Park. It looks fantastic, and it's much improved for fire prevention. Thank you.
Land trust, that's good. Thank you, Andy. Next item, the big item, what we have today, a public hearing. And this is a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to amend Chapter 2 of the Nevada County Land Use and Development Code, reducing barriers of housing production and as listed in the staff report. Also to maintain consistency in the general plan and the community regions. So with that, we have Kyle as our planner on board, and love to hear from you, Kyle.
Thank you, Chair Duncan, Planning Commissioners. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Kyle Smith, and I'm a senior planner with the Planning Department, and I am here to present the 2023 zoning ordinance amendments to remove barriers to housing production. So for a little bit of background, the Planning Department is required by General Plan Housing Element Policy to review our zoning code every year for consistency with state code and also consistency within our own internal policy documents. In addition, in 2023, and years prior, the Board of Supervisors has identified both housing and homelessness as two of their objectives. And then in recent years, the California State Legislature has passed a series of laws related to, related to housing development in California, including those listed here, as well as other laws that have been enacted and codified. And then finally, in 2021, the Board of Supervisors adopted Resolution 21018 and directed Planning Department staff to apply for a REAP grant, a Regional Early Action Planning grant from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. The Planning Department was successful and was granted the award in 2022, and we received our final contract award in late fall of 2022. Some of the outreach and engagement for this project is listed here. So starting in the fall of 2022, Planning Department staff conducted a series of roundtables and stakeholder interviews with governmental entities across the spectrum from federal to local, as well as community members and stakeholders from the housing development arena. The county also developed a project website with the link shown here that shows all the documentation for the project. And the planning department put the initial public draft out for a about 34-day public comment period earlier this spring, and also hosted a community workshop here at the Rood Center upstairs in the Empire Mine Room prior to the close of that comment period to hear from community members in first person. In addition, there will be at least 2 public hearings, this hearing today, and at least 1 Board of Supervisors hearing that is to be determined. So digging into the project a little bit. So these zoning ordinance amendments include a series of amendments broken up into these 3 broad categories. So the first being updates to essentially comply with these changes to state law, mostly relating to allowing additional housing types, ensuring fair housing permitting, and some changing or reduced development standards. In addition to those statutory updates, planning department staff, through just our work analyzing projects and through our outreach and engagement with the community, identified some other policies that could be adjusted to remove barriers to housing production to help build more housing in the county. And these relate to some residential development standards, but also some density standards in community regions and spheres of influence. And then finally, there are some technical updates to reflect legislative intent. These are things that could have been typos that planning department staff have caught over time that we just haven't opened up the zoning code to fix yet. Including some open space requirements, some use allowances, and some definitions. So getting into the statutory updates, some of the big changes that have seen multiple changes in state law over the last few years are accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units, or ADUs and JADUs. This is the state definition for the kind of colloquial grandmother units, mother-in-law units, those sorts of things. It's kind of the secondary housing unit to the primary residence on the parcel. Essentially, state law has allowed for ADUs and JADUs to be permitted ministerially, that is, with the building, just through a building permit. There is no land use entitlement or hearing like this that ADUs or JADUs would be required to go through. And these ADUs and JADUs are essentially allowed countywide on all parcels that are permitted for single-family residential uses. In addition to some other development standards that are mandated by the state, one of the benefits here is that sprinklers and solar requirements are not required for the ADUs if they were not required for the primary residence when it was constructed. So it's not necessarily moving the goalposts for these houses that were previously developed. In addition to ADUs, another sort of big ticket item is the Senate Bill 9 lot splits and second dwelling units. This also provides a ministerial permitting process for both a subdivision, a lot split of one lot into two, as well as to allow duplexes on parcels that are previously zoned for single-family residences. So it's essentially increasing the potential density of parcels. However, these SB 9 allowances for both lot splits and for the second dwelling only apply to those parcels that are zoned R1, that is the county's single-family residential zoning district, and the parcels zoned R1 that are located in areas that have been designated as urbanized areas or urban clusters by the United States Census. We're currently using 2010 census maps as we're awaiting the 2020 census maps to be released. Another area of change is with the California State Density Bonus Law. So this law provides additional density bonuses, incentives, and other concessions to housing project developers when they set aside portions of the units for lower income populations. Another one of the big changes here is that the affordability requirements for those units has been increased from a period of 30 years to 55 years. So the units built under this density bonus law or utilizing these provisions would be required to maintain that housing as affordable for a period of 55 years. Another important aspect is employee housing. There were some clarifications to the state employee housing law, where it allows for that same ministerial approval for 12 or for housing for employees for up to 12 units or 36 beds, whichever is greater. And this is for housing developments that are also permitted and regulated through the State Department of Housing and Community Development. So this is not our county employee housing. Another item is in-home family daycares are treated like a residential accessory use. So these have that similar ministerial pathway where no land use entitlement or planning permit is required, as long as the operator is licensed by the state similarly. And then the last item I have on here for statutory updates relates to fair housing. So there are a number of housing types, including emergency shelters, transitional and supportive housing, single-room occupancies, that have traditionally been treated, or that could have been treated differently than similar types of housing, whether it be a single-family residential or multifamily residential. And these changes to state law essentially treat housing equally. So it doesn't, these changes don't treat transitional and supportive housing different than single-family residential housing if it were in a single-family residence. So the similar permitting pathways apply to all these types of housing that would apply to any standard market rate housing. So in addition to those statutory changes, there were a number of changes that were identified either by community members or by staff. The first item here is additional housing types. So currently, our Land Use and Development Code allows for duplexes, duets, and fourplexes in the R1 and RA zones. As long as they are consistent with density, so we're increasing the areas that these are allowed to within those similar urbanized areas and urban clusters that SB 9 applies to. so that we can treat this similar type of development with a similar permitting pathway. And it also achieves our general plan policies of promoting housing density within our sort of urbanized areas, our community regions, and our spheres of influence where we have the infrastructure to support this level of development. And again, it only allows for this type of development if the density is consistent with the underlying zoning and general plan requirements. Another housing type allowance that we're proposing to change is removing a requirement that multifamily residential structures be limited to 4 units in the structure in RA zones. We are proposing to remove this so long as similarly the housing development proposes units consistent with density. So if they were allowed to have 6 units on a parcel, those 6 units could be in one structure rather than in 2 to hopefully decrease some of those housing development costs. And then the last one here is to, currently the Nevada County Land Use and Development Code has an 1,800 square foot maximum size for employee housing, and this is whether it's for a single unit or a single employee or up to 5 employees. And so we were proposing to just remove that maximum structure size requirement to treat these similar to other housing types. Single family residential units don't have a maximum housing type in Nevada County, and we were proposing to treat employee housing in a similar fashion. The next item here is residential minimum density standards. So we are proposing to increase the maximum density for residential uses in a couple of areas. First, in mixed use zones, so these are in our commercial and industrial districts. The Land Use and Development Code currently allows for up to 4 units per acre in mixed use areas, and we are proposing to increase that to 6 within our community regions, again, focusing the development where the general plan proposes and where infrastructure exists. And because we heard from community members and through the development of a couple of our area plans throughout the county that this is a housing type that is desired. Then the other area where we are proposing to increase residential density is in our R2 zoning districts. That's our medium density residential zoning districts. So currently the maximum density in R2 is 6 units per acre, and we're proposing to increase that to 8 units per acre. And again, only within the spheres of influence of the 2 cities in town. So those are the spheres that are identified by the cities in town, again, to focus this development to where the general plan prioritizes and where infrastructure exists. And in order to increase the density in these zoning districts, we will also have to amend the general plan in order to maintain internal consistency among these 2 policy documents, our zoning code and our general plan. So we're amending the general plan and the zoning code to make these densities essentially match. We are also proposing to remove or to change some development standards for ADUs. So the Land Use and Development Code currently has maximum size limitations for garages and patios that we plan on removing and treating them similar to other residential development where we don't necessarily have maximum garage or maximum patio size. And another one that has some additional clarification from the memorandum that you see in front of you is removing the requirement that ADUs have a new septic tank installed and changing that to only requiring a new tank or system when the existing system does not have capacity. So current law requires a new tank whenever an ADU is built, but we're proposing to give homeowners a little bit of leeway if they planned for some existing capacity when they installed their septic system. We were also proposing to reduce some of the minimum parking requirements for new housing developments because it was identified as a cost for housing development, and maybe and the minimum parking requirements may be a little bit high for different housing types. And we're, in addition to the state density bonus law changes, we are proposing to maintain and enhance the existing senior citizens and disabled persons density bonuses that the county has on top of state law. That gives additional both density, but also some incentives related to parking or other concessions when these housing developments include a number of different incentives for their future residents, whether it be cooking facilities, meals on site, dog facilities, those sort of things, a number of different amenities. And then the last item here are a couple of pieces relating to ground mount solar array standards. So California Green Building Code requires new housing development generally to include solar panels as part of their development to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and among other state and regional goals. And we are proposing both reducing setback requirements to align with our pool standards, so treating these solar arrays similarly to our pools so they can better utilize the sunlight that enters the property, and also including some relaxed permitting standards and steep slopes so that in some cases where best management practices are applied, these ground mount solar arrays can be developed with what are called pile foundations, essentially drilling holes into the ground to support the foundation, because we can assume that these would be less impactful than, say, grading and pouring a pad. So we've worked with our building department to identify some best management practices that we can apply to have this ministerial permitting process for ground mount solar supporting residential units. And then finally are some technical updates. This first legacy parcel road frontage standard is something that we heard from our Contractors Association. Nevada County has a lot of what I'm calling legacy parcels here. They're legally created parcels that have been created prior to our current site development standards. So they may not meet road frontage requirements or have road frontage at all, and this could preclude a number of parcels from being developed without building a road out there. So we are proposing allowing these non-standard legacy parcels, as long as they are legally created and have legal access to achieve fire safety standards, to enter into boundary line adjustments with their neighbors to help them become more developable. In addition, we have some clarifications for accessory uses. This is just updating our land use tables to clarify that accessory uses are meant to be accessory to an allowed use on the property. The open space requirements noted here, the last time our land use and development code was updated and put online, the greater than and less than symbols in one of the tables were actually inversed. So we are correcting that to align with our general plan policy to require more open space in the eastern county related to western county. And in a similar fashion, the allowance of communication towers in industrial zones was left off of the allowable land use table. The intent when the code was adopted was to allow them in industrial zones, and we're just cleaning up our land use table to clarify that communication towers are allowed subject to a use permit in a similar fashion as other zoning districts. And then there are a couple of cleanups in the allowable use tables and definitions and government code citations that have also been included in this technical update component. So as far as the land use entitlement components are concerned, this project includes 2 land use entitlements. The first here being the amendments to the Land Use and Development Code, both chapters 2 relating to almost all articles except for our enforcement article, and then also for chapter 4, and chapter 4 is clarifying that SB 9 lot split allowance in our subdivisions article, or in our subdivisions chapter, excuse me. And then in addition, like I mentioned before, in order to achieve those increased maximum residential density standards, we also have to amend these 3 general plan policies. And it's essentially just to allow for those increased density either in the community regions or in the urbanized areas, depending on those general plan designations. And then finally, the last item is a notice of exemption pursuant to CEQA and the CEQA guidelines, because all future housing development projects will be reviewed against CEQA or other and our land use and development code, excuse me, prior to environmental clearance. And this is just a legislative action to amend both the land use and development code and the general plan. So with that, the project recommendations from staff are shown here on screen, and I am happy to respond to any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you, Kyle. Does anyone have questions for Kyla? Good.
So let's see, in no particular order, or actually this is kind of following as they came up. So SB 9, does that increase the FAR ratios for allowable?
So Nevada County doesn't actually have floor area ratios in our site development standards as it sits. We have what are called impervious surface coverage requirements in Nevada County, which achieves a similar intent but by a different metric. And this does not amend those, so our impervious surface coverage requirements will still apply, and SB 9 duplex or lot splits or developments are required to be consistent with local development standards as long as they are objective, which our impervious surface coverages are. It's percentage based.
Okay. The fair housing, there's no public comment triggers at all at this point, if those are exactly the same as any other housing?
Not necessarily. So they're just treated like other housing. So multifamily residential development still generally requires some level of hearing, even if it's just a design review. So these housing types would be treated in a similar fashion. But to your point, if any of these housing types were proposed in, say, a single-family residential unit, then there would be no hearing or no public hearing or discretionary approval requirement. Similarly to how we don't require approvals for market rate single-family residents.
Right. You had one thing that said consistent with underlying general plan or zoning densities, and if we can look at that slide again really quick. Yeah, what does that mean?
So this means that if a parcel would be allowed to have 2 units consistent with density, let's say they're in an RA3 zone. So that means in Nevada County, it's a residential agricultural zone parcel with a 3-acre minimum parcel size. But if this parcel were to be 6 acres per se, they would be allowed to have 2 residences because our density is based on the minimum parcel size generally in our residential zoning districts. So Similarly, we could ramp that up if it were an RA3 district and were 15 acres. We would be, a property owner would be allowed to have up to 5 units on that parcel through a number of different mechanisms, whether it be traditional multifamily development or what we call a dwelling group, which is also defined in our code. So there are a number of different ways that, but essentially it's so that the consistency with the underlying density is they essentially have to have enough acreage that if that lot were to be subdivided, that's how many residences would result on those subdivided lots.
So given that example, RA3, but you have 15 acres, so generally, always, that would have meant that you could have subdivided and had 5. So this change doesn't mean that now you can have 10?
Not this change that we're showing here on the screen. No, this is to allow for these different types of housing. So in R1 and RA currently in the Land Use and Development Code, we do not allow duplexes, duets, or fourplexes to be developed outside of community regions, even if they are consistent with density. The Land Use and Development Code would require 5 single-family residential units rather than somebody putting those all into one structure. So this allowance, or multiple structures. So this allowance just allows those different housing types. So it's not 5 houses. It could be 2 duplexes in a house or a 4-plex in a house, but just giving the developers or the homeowners a little bit more allowance to build the residential types that they would like.
So I thought SB 9 was allowing what was a single family to actually have 2 units, whether that's a duplex or not, but this isn't the same as that.
So that item was not. That item was a little bit different, but you are correct in that SB 9 does essentially allow for a duplex on those lots that previously only allowed 1 unit. So this does increase that, what we call potential density for those R1 units in the urbanized clusters.
So the RA3, because that's agriculture and is a 3, it's not in an urban area, then it doesn't apply to those. So that's what we're saying, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. The SB 9 allowance only applies in those urbanized areas, and then also only applies to R1. So it does not apply to our RA or other ag estate, other zoning districts that allow for residential development.
Okay. Septic tank capacity, is that generally based on how much can perk or what size the tank is?
Both, to be generally. So both the length of the leach field and the soils that they exist, how quickly it can perk, but also the size of the tank to incorporate generally the number of bedrooms. So it's a function of both the tank and the disposal field. So it's not necessarily one or the other.
And at some point you said that all would be subject to CEQA. Is that currently true? I thought that there was a number of housing that was no longer subject to CEQA.
So there are a number of housing types, both previously and a couple of additions and recent changes to state law that allow for exemptions to CEQA. Those exemptions generally make the assumption that the development would have less than or no impact. And one of these includes the ADUs, JADUs, fair housing, all of those types of projects, as long as they're in a single-family residential unit or achieve the development standards that are consistent with state law. The assumption is that they are minimal impacts and then consistent with that CEQA exemption. So if there were a project that were proposed, let's say a multifamily development unit that would require a use permit, that would still be required to undergo CEQA generally, unless it's utilize one of the, kind of SB 35 or state CEQA streamlining allowances.
And then it looks like a lot of these are for R1 or single family. Are there changes to the multifamily districts? I think something came past at R2.
Yes, we are proposing, so most of these changes do apply to residential dwellings generally. So it could range the gamut of single family to multifamily and sort of everything in between. But as far as the zones, most of those increases or changes, you're correct, were either in the RA or R1 where we promote the single-family residential, except for that density increases in our R2 zoning districts within the spheres of influence of the city. Again, trying to be consistent with our general plan and promote that housing development where the infrastructure exists.
And so generally with all of these changes, what kind of impact or effect would you expect?
Well, we hope that it is easier to build housing development in some of these, community regions and spheres of influence, and then generally throughout the county. So we do expect that housing development proposals to come in that, will be utilizing these, specifically a lot of the ADU allowances and single-family residential allowances. We get a lot of permit requests and zoning, kind of zoning clearance requests for people to have their family have a house on the property. And I think that these will help achieve both that kind of multi-generational housing allowance, but also to allow for the market in Nevada County to build these different housing types that maybe have not previously been allowed that are wanted by the market.
So a lot of jurisdictions have gone ahead and approved floor plans or manufacturers kind of in advance so that you don't go through the same review process. Have we done that?
Yes, as part of that REAP grant that funds this, similar parallel project is included here too, or not included here, but we're working on, which is an ADU workbook. And then paired with that ADU workbook, the building department has actually already released a series of pre-reviewed master plans that are available to the public on a significantly reduced price point for pre-reviewed, already stamped plans that they just have to essentially find a site for. I think there are 3 pre-reviewed plans, but yeah, that is absolutely something that the county has been undertaking in parallel to this project to help kind of reduce some of those cost barriers to housing production.
Thank you. I think I've run out of questions for the moment.
Thank you. Well, perhaps if something else comes up, you'll bring it up. How about you, Terry?
So I'm interested in how many people came to these workshops. I know you reached out to the Contractors Association and others. Was there interest in this out there?
So for the community workshop, we had 12 people from the public show up. That was on June 8th, earlier this month, before the close of the public comment period. That was the only quote-unquote workshop that we had. The other outreach was stakeholder interviews,
right.
Sort of like either a one-on-one or a group, or I had some of these roundtables with some of our governmental partners, and we can sort of talk through some of these issues together.
Okay. So could you go back to the slide 1? No, I'm sorry. The one, keep going, one more. This. No, that one. So are these on this page, are these mandated because of the law changes in Sacramento?
Only this first tranche of updates, the additional housing types, fair housing, and development standards. The other housing implementation updates are not necessarily required by law, but it is the county implementing housing element policies. And then the technical updates are mostly cleanup, things that we've caught.
So bullet 1 is Sacramento telling us this is how it's going to be in California. And it's a second bullet is, gee, we went around and we asked some questions like, what else would you guys like out there? And we came up with these ideas. Is that sort of how it is in plain English?
Generally, yes. So we got this REAP grant award in order to comply with state law, and planning department staff thought that while we were in here opening up our zoning code, we may as well go out to the community and get some input and make other changes that they see fall into this same kind of reducing barriers, so that we can, do everything with one go.
And Commissioner McAteer, to add on to that, the county is preempted by many state laws, and so we have to refer applicants and the public to other state laws to review what they have to do to get to these ADUs, if you will. And so part of this project is to put that into our code so it's directly in front of them, as well as our planners who are working on this, instead of trying to find government code section 65582.07, so on and so forth. It's actually will be right in front of us.
Great. And tell me about relations with the cities, since the cities are having to do bullet number 1, and so just tell me how the three cities in the county work together on this topic.
So the cities in the county generally coordinate on housing policy as it's developed. But we did not undertake this collectively, mostly because we're sort of in different stages of compliance. So Truckee, for instance, just recently adopted their housing elements, so they were actually ahead of the game on most of these and had already adopted. Grass Valley has already made some changes to their code as these things come up. And so I think it just depends on the organization and how they choose to undertake achieving compliance, whether they do it kind of constantly or as they come up or in these tranches.
So my last question is, I'd like you to help me walk through R1. I'd just like to deal with R1, okay? Because that's where most people get willy-nilly on. So in R1, I have a house in R1, and I've decided that, and just bear with me because you may say that has no applicability. So in the Bay Area, a huge issue is that you convert your garage into some form of living space. So if I come to you and say I want to make my garage illegal housing, is that affected? Is that being changed because of these laws here?
Essentially, yes, it is. So that garage could be turned into one of two types of dwelling units that are being affected here, depending on size and other development standards. So first would be that JADU or junior ADU. So this is an allowance to allow for a residence inside of the existing walls of a residential structure. To include a garage as long as it is fewer than 500 square feet. So if that garage was fewer than 500 square feet, it could be converted to a JADU through a building permit and coming up to code. If it were larger than 500 square feet, or say if it were detached from the house, it could be converted into an ADU, that traditional accessory dwelling unit. But essentially, yes, these changes do allow for essentially an ADU and a JADU to be developed on every lot that allows for residential uses. So not just R1, most of our zoning districts countywide.
So outside of doing my garage, tell me under a junior, what's another example of it? Is that just adding another room onto the existing house?
So the junior ADU is actually required to cannot expand the footprint of the house. So it's essentially intended for that, which would at least I quintessentially think of as that mother-in-law unit, kind of an apartment either above the garage or turning some other space into a standalone apartment for that, multi-generational living on one parcel.
Okay.
So it does not allow, it does not allow for the increase of the footprint of the existing residence for the JADUs.
So there's no new allowances in this law dealing with if I push out from my house?
So there are, if you were to call that an ADU. So you can increase either an existing accessory structure or the existing primary residence to establish an accessory dwelling unit. And the expansion of an existing structure, I believe, is limited to 150 square feet. If you give me a second to flip through here, I can clarify that.
So let's just say it is 150. So you're referring to, so I can push out without a whole host of regulations, but it has to be under 150 square feet?
And so both ADUs and JADUs are, and all of these other allowances are still required to achieve all of our site development standards. So that is property line setbacks, that is hazardous vegetation clearance, impervious surface coverage, as we mentioned earlier. So all of the standard development requirements would apply. This just gives the allowance to build this additional housing type.
Okay, so let's go on with that mother-in-law separated house, okay? What would you call that?
An accessory dwelling unit, an ADU?
Accessory. So if I want to put on this mother-in-law house, this separate standalone house, I have to be able to fit that house on my property using the existing setbacks, et cetera. There's no allowances relative to that.
There are additional allowances for setbacks as they relate to ADUs. ADUs are allowed by state law to encroach into encroach up to 4 feet up to within 4 feet of property lines, side and rear property lines, excuse me. So ADUs would be allowed to go within 4 feet of those side and rear property lines, but our county-wide front yard setbacks would still apply.
Okay. So I have my single-family house, and it sits on 1/4 of an acre, and I want to add a mother-in-law house to it. This mother-in-law house can be up to how big? What is that limit? What's that?
If it is detached from the house, the maximum size is 1,200 square feet.
Okay, so 1,200 square feet. I could potentially tie it into my septic system, and its setbacks are now down to 4 feet on front and maybe sides and back, something like that. What did I miss in talking about these R1 in an R1 community?
In addition to those ADUs and JADUs, the SB 9, both the lot split and the additional potential density allowance. So that R1 lot in an urbanized area as defined by a census could theoretically be split into 2 lots and then a duplex or 2 units put up on each of those 2 new lots.
And tell me about the size of that lot that would be allowed to be split.
So there are minimum parcel sizes as defined in state law. I believe the minimum parcel size is, it's very small, 1,200 square feet, very, very small. However, both these lot splits would still be required to similarly to achieve those site development standards, where they would have to show both a adequate area for septic disposal and repair area. So there are site limitations that are not just the minimum parcel size limitations.
So I'm up on Ridge Road, all those homes up on Ridge Road, they have fairly, I don't know how big of lots they are, but potentially in the back of my lot, I could be building this 1,200 square foot property. And not only that, I could probably get a lot split and have it as a separate taxable lot, assessor lot.
So potentially. So yes, if it were in the, I'm not entirely sure, but let's say that it is in one of these urbanized areas, then yes, if you were to do that lot split, there's a number of things that could occur, but yeah, you could have the residents and the ADU on both lots.
So are there places that are this urbanized, whatever the term you used, within the county of Nevada's jurisdiction? Where would those be?
Yes, we have a couple, and they are actually generally they are focused around our community regions. It seems that our general plan policies of promoting urbanized development in these areas are working. So it's generally around the cities of Grass Valley and Nevada City, the town of Truckee, the Lake of the Pines and Lake Wildwood communities in those areas generally around, and Alta Sierra and portions of Alta Sierra as well. On some of Penn Valley, if you'd like, I can probably pull up a map and show the commission.
At some point, I'd really love to see where that urban, what did you use the word urban?
Urban clusters or
urban clusters.
Areas.
Where urban clusters exist within the county of Nevada, within our jurisdiction, not within the city's jurisdiction, but where would those exist within our sphere of influence?
Yeah, so they
Do you have one available there, Kyle? I mean, I think you pretty well covered the locations.
Not available, but I can pull one up fairly quickly. So generally around our community regions, but they're bounded more on a census block level than any other political boundary. So as I'm scrolling in here, these areas that are, these areas that are yellow. And it looks like we may have new 2020 data, and this is decreased. So it looks like it's actually just around the cities, potentially within our spheres of influence. I want to make sure that this is right. So based off of what this is a mapping portal from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. This is sort of our state comprehensive planning agency. And this is showing that, granted I haven't looked at this in a while, but this may include 2020 census data, which is essentially just limited to around our cities and the spheres of influence. I'm not sure if this is exactly city boundaries, but it looks like it's
they have
close.
county information. Yeah.
Oh, that just puts that up. So
You know what? Click on city.
Oh yeah, look at that. There we go.
So therefore, really, if what I'm asking the question is that what you've updated relative to these urbanized areas really don't exist within the county sphere.
So the maps that we were looking at from 2010 had several areas that were in the sphere. So I'm not 100% confident, we'll have to look at this a little bit further, that this map is entirely accurate, because it did include areas outside of Nevada City, and the county is currently processing an SB9 lot split in an area that's the county jurisdiction. So we'll have to relook at that.
Something's up with this map.
Okay.
It doesn't accurately show it, because there's out past this, and it's not showing up.
Okay. So finally, my question is, we have a lot of land that is owned, I guess the word is, by Bureau of Land Management, that is sitting fallow for the most part. And I'm sort of surprised that the state even though this is a federal agency, isn't doing something in rural California dealing with all of this BLM land that is potential housing, and there's just no movement afoot in terms of us here in Nevada County working with BLM in terms of the thousands of acres that they have in this community. I know that, for example, I live in an area that down the hill from me is 20 acres of BLM land, and that's sitting with no homes, no nothing on it, and just left, wild. And not only is it a fire hazard, but it's just a non-productive piece of property, which is unfortunate. You have any comment on that?
So just generally, the federal government preempts both state and local laws. So the Bureau can do as they are directed. However, not necessarily on BLM land, but the state has adopted the Surplus Lands Act, which is state entities working to identify surplus lands for housing. And that will also essentially trickle down to local governments over the years as the state does this. So although I don't think that federal lands were included in that, they might be, but I can get back to you because there may be some sort of intergovernmental coordination component of that Surplus Lands Act that could enable some sort of, housing on federal land opportunities.
Well, I just think that just because the federal government owns thousands of acres in Nevada County, essentially the BLM owns thousands of acres in Nevada County, and that we're just sort of like, well, it's the federal government. And I think that's unfortunate. I think there's some leadership needed to deal with those lands in this community. I'm not talking about forested lands in the Tahoe National Forest. I'm talking about these, and you know them, they're all over the place, these bits and pieces just sitting out there that could be definitely used for housing and could be put onto the tax rolls so that there could be a land trade between BLM and private owners or whatever else. But it's just a shame that I think that that's a lost opportunity, and it's a fire hazard at its highest level. I think everyone would agree BLM lands are sitting out there, and they're like little torch pockets throughout this community. So that's my little soapbox. Thank you.
The proposal today, I think it really does give the county an opportunity to increase affordable housing options. And I think that's the intent of where we're going. But before I go into that one, so when we received the grants from HCD, did you hire a consultant, or how did that met out?
So that grant award included a number of projects. For these projects to update the code, we did not hire a consultant to do that. We did that with our existing planning staff. But some of the other components of that grant award did require us to hire some consultants. So the ADU workbook is a joint effort with a number of other foothill counties, and we hired a consultant. I can't pull their name off the top of my head. But another project is also working with the cities, and they have hired consultants to undertake some analysis of needed infrastructure to support future housing development.
Mm-hmm. And so that looked at the energy grid and to support these additional units.
Those infrastructure analyses I don't think are energy related. I think they're more water infrastructure related.
The pass-through grant to the cities is focused on wastewater primarily. I believe Nevada City, the city of Grass Valley, and then the Truckee Sanitary District were all awarded funds through our REAP grant to look at some of their key areas where they'd like to, at least for the two cities, to look at where they'd like to develop housing. And in fact, Nevada City is focused on areas they identified as affordable housing in their housing element. And then I think Grass Valley looked at some areas in their new annexation area down by Hanson Brothers. And then the Truckee Sanitary District was going to pull their members to see what kind of development they want to see grow over time.
Right. I think it's certainly worthwhile, though, for the county to consider where the energy is going to come from, especially when increasing density, to anticipate that there are going to be some unmet needs. I mean, currently there are unmet needs and we haven't increased density. So I think that needs to be a consideration. And also CCNRs, you know, I mean, recently we've had a lot of communities, you know, developments that have imposed CCNRs. And I suspect that most of them have no clue about what's coming down the pike here. And I know our community meetings are intended to alert the community to understand changes and how they might be impacted by them. I think there was a pretty poor turnout, and, you know, consistently, I've been concerned that, you know, when government announces that they're going to have workshops or community information handed out, the community fails to understand what it really means and what that impact might be. And I think in terms of, you know, really encouraging public participation, that it makes sense to, you know, break it down into understandable language as to how folks, you know, why they should be concerned or why they should participate. And oftentimes, I mean, you probably are the ones who receive the brunt of these changes because people are coming in saying what the hell happened and when, and why, and when they could have been part of the process or at least had an opportunity to understand that there was a time where they could participate. The other one is county care homes. In the past, that's been a real hot topic. You know, I mean, usually when it's 6 beds or less, I think there is no public input or public notification. So this is going to raise that. And it sort of reminds me about the county's project over here, where there could have been a lot more concern. So I think that there needs to be information being sent out to the community to understand that the county is changing, new laws are in place, and these might potentially impact them. I mean, once it's adopted, they really have little ability to change, but at least knowledge that there are changes afoot. So before they get really excited and come down complaining to the department about what the heck is going on, that they've had some information beforehand. Because with increasing density, I mean, especially in the more urbanized areas, we start to lose what makes Nevada County special, what makes our neighborhoods special, and why people want to move here. And suddenly we're changing everything to be where they came from, and they don't like that. But certainly many of us who live here, we like the uniqueness of Nevada County and the different options that it offers. Community meetings, I think we could have maybe held more. I mean, by my accounts, it looked like we held one. We definitely had stakeholder groups, but I think we could have done more in that regard. 12 people turning out from the county as community members is really appalling on something that does impact them. And my concern is that they didn't understand or knew that this is what was coming out. So public participation, I think, could be improved. And that may be something that the department wants to take on as to how can we better respond to the people who live here? How can we better educate them, keep them in the loop? I know you have your statement that we are accountable, we collaborate, we have compassion, integrity, and service to the community. What does that mean? You know, could we accomplish that by having better public participation? So that was pretty much my concern. I think my fellow commissioners stated their comments, and, oh, Danny, yes.
So of these changes, how many of these were really dictated by the state versus how many were something that you guys decided specifically different from what the state's putting into place?
As far as proportion, I would say that the majority, probably more than 60%, are requirements in order to be consistent with state law. And the other probably 30 are housing element implementation, and maybe less than 10 of technical updates is probably my kind of rough breakdown there.
And I will note that the housing element is a policy document adopted by the Board of Supervisors at the recommendation of the Planning Commission that has a number of programs and policies in it that the board intended for planning to implement. And so we took this opportunity to get some state funding to help the process of implementing some of those programs and policies.
I'd like to piggyback on your comment, because it goes back to my map issue, which is I'd really like to see where these R1 changes that are actually within the county of Nevada's jurisdiction. So then we are able then to be able to say to ourselves, well, gee, could there be an outreach out to XYZ community so that they understand what is available, or at least to their homeowners association or whatever else, so that then maybe they're, we tell them, hey, this came down from Sacramento, but I want you to know what it says. And we would know the areas that actually would be affected. Is that a possibility?
I think your comment is noted. I will note that we did send out notices to all of our special interest groups, which includes homeowners associations that requested notification. We also agree that we'd like more participation in these processes, but we did have a very robust discussion at our 12-people community meeting that talked about alternative housing and other things going on in the county that would be good for us to look at. I'll also note that there's a lot of these state mandated changes that we don't have a whole lot of leeway as a county to not implement. Whether we put them on in our codes or not, we're still required to enforce those requirements.
I'm not here to pick a fight relative to that issue at all. I just think that if the commissioners had a map which said these are the areas that are really going to be affected in this R1 changes, because that's where the issues are going to be. It's not going to be in an industrial zone where you decide to put up a fourplex. So if we saw those, then at our next meeting we could begin to see where the effect is going to be and what type of outreach has taken place to those communities. Thank you.
Make sure that you guys understand that these already have gone into effect in these areas via the state laws. So that...
Yeah, I understand that.
Right. So this is, I think, in a lot of ways, just a codification in our own local laws, right? So
correct.
But yes, I mean, it'd be great to see where that is.
I don't know where these urbanized areas are. That's all I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So staff would agree and note your comment and do agree that.
So Terry, are you asking then that we hold over the action today to the next meeting?
No, I'm not. I think we're codifying something that's already come, as Danny's noted, has come down the pike. But I do believe that I would like to see the map so that I have a better understanding as a commissioner as to those communities that are going to be directly affected, and then potentially turning to the staff and saying to them, gee, it might be a good idea if you went out to the Echo Ridge group community and said, let me just tell you what's come down from Sacramento.
Agreed. I would agree, because oftentimes some of these HOAs, who knows who is in charge, given the year and what their attention span is, or capacity to understand what's coming at their people that they represent. And sometimes losing the language, the official language, and putting it in plainer terms to get their attention. This could impact you and your residents. just to try and get the message out there. And I think we can do better in that regard.
I think staff can commit to looking at the urban cluster map, because obviously that one didn't work, that we tried to put up, look at what our R1 zoning is and create a list of property owners for our notification for a board meeting should the Planning Commission desire to move the project forward.
Okay. It is interesting that you say you only had 12 at the community meeting. You must have satisfied the affordable housing folks. I mean, in past, when we've had projects in front of us, the room was filled. You know, it was near capacity, and the fact that none of them showed up is curious. And so I'm assuming that you met with them and that they understood what was here.
It was a near 2.5-hour discussion or so.
But I'm going to go back to, but I'll bet that the Echo Ridge Homeowners Association is clueless about what's about to happen to them.
Absolutely. And I would suspect Lake Wildwood and Lake of the Pines may also be not understanding what's happened, because how does the state law trump the CCNRs?
Yeah, it actually very specifically does in the language of SB 9. But
yeah,
but I think that a lot of the conversation right now is about things that are going to happen to somebody. But on the other hand, I mean, I think that potentially there's plenty of people that live there that would be excited to be able to build a small ADU and have their, you know, grown kid or their mother-in-law or a renter or whatever live in that's something that is now available to them that hasn't been in the past. And they can convert their garage without worrying about getting turned into code compliance.
You're right. There will probably be people who will be happy about it, and there will be people who are not so happy. But at least we want to make sure that they know what's coming to them. And the cause for celebration may be there. Thank you, Danny. Yes, you're right. So I would suspect, though, that the HOAs don't know what's coming.
Except for those HOAs on our notice list, which is around 200 entities that we sent it to. And I will note that state law did change CCNRs prohibiting ADUs several years back.
Mm-hmm.
And although not necessarily through this process, but over the years since the ADU law has been adopted, we have had these conversations with HOAs and other sorts of neighborhood groups, not necessarily pertaining to this exact code update, but these ADU requirements in state law. And I do also want to add that in addition to that sort of formal outreach and engagement that the planning department did, a lot of what we learned is actually at the counter when people come in, either, you know, code compliant, people, you know, talking about their neighbors and, you know, turning in issues, or people wanting to build something that they can't through our allowance. So it's that kind of informal learning and discussion with the community that's very helpful for this process also.
Mm-hmm. But it's still only a small percentage of the community at large. The one interesting point that I picked up is that the ADUs don't have to comply with the fire improvements if the existing dwelling unit was developed prior to these conditions. That's huge information. I mean, because adding the sprinklers has always been, you know, a major cost factor, you know, prohibiting legally building an ADU.
I think what Kyle probably was going to state is, you know, the exterior of the home still has to meet wildland urban interface for criteria, the
Right.
defensible space, those sort of things.
Right. But the interior sprinkling was always one that kept coming up. So, anyway, with that, any other questions for staff at this point? No? Are we ready for
A public hearing?
public comment? Yes. And we have someone in the audience, who might want to speak, but we're going to open it right now. And we're going to close it because no one rushed to the front, and bring it back to the commission.
She's coming.
Oh, Okay, I'll reopen that. State your
Thank
name
you.
and address for the record, please.
Mimi Simmons, 12578 Pasquale Road, Nevada City. I'm wearing a couple of hats here. I'm a broker, and so I deal with a lot of people that want to have ADUs, and I'm on a committee that Craig was on originally with the other heads of the different departments to try and make the county more friendly to the consumers. So there is a group that's already working on this. And you know, steps that we can take to be more proactive to the community and approachable. So, because a lot of people want to do things behind the scenes because they're afraid of the county. So when I joined this committee, I have a guest house on my property that I've had for 15 years. I've never rented it, but I decided to throw it in to the hat to get it converted to a legal ADU, so doing the after-the-fact permit. County's been great to work with. I've had some processes to go through, and gratefully, we didn't have to do sprinkler systems because our home is 25 years old. And there were some other requirements. My big concern is that we converted one of our bedrooms in the main house to a den. So we have actually in the main house a 2-bedroom, 3-bath home. And then the guest house now could be the 3rd bedroom for the septic system, so which it meets, and I've had everything checked out. But I was told last week that I have to put in a separate septic system, or septic tank, pardon me. I've already had the Perkin mantle done, but had to put in a separate septic tank. But I already have an existing 3-bedroom septic tank. So one of my reasons to be here is just to hear how this ferrets through, because that stops my process. The footprint of my property, albeit 5 acres, I only have an acre that's level. The rest of it goes down into the canyon. I have no place to put a second septic system or even a tank. So that stops my whole process. So I'm here to cheerlead on that if we can pass not having to put in a septic tank, because the way I have designed this, it meets my current system. So.
Thank you, Mimi. It was nice to hear from you.
Yes, thank you.
All right, I'm going to close the public hearing. It's always good to hear that people, the community has had favorable interactions with the department, so thank you, guys. We appreciate hearing that. And so with that, any other comments? Ready to hear a motion?
I'm happy to make a motion to recommend that the Board of Supervisors find the project statutorily exempt pursuant sections 15274 and 15282H, and categorically exempt pursuant to section 15061B3, the CEQA guidelines.
I'll second that.
Motion's been made and seconded. Tyler, would you call the roll?
Commissioner Millen,
Yes.
Commissioner McAteer,
Yes.
Acting Chair Duncan.
Yes.
Motion passed 3-0 with 2 members absent.
Further, would like to make a motion to recommend that the Board of Supervisors adopt the ordinance amending Chapter 2 of the Nevada County Land Use and Development Code and Chapter 4 of the Nevada County Land Use and Development Code.
I'll second that.
Motion's been made and seconded. Tyler, would you call the roll?
Commissioner McAteer,
Yes.
Commissioner Millman,
Yes.
Acting Chair Duncan.
Yes.
And finally, make a motion to recommend that the Board of Supervisors adopt the resolution amending Chapter 1 of the land use element of the general plan.
Second.
And
Motion's
Commissioner,
been made and seconded. Tyler,
Commissioner
call the
Millman?
roll.
Yes.
Commissioner McAteer,
Yes.
and Acting Chair Duncan.
Yes. Motion carries. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mimi. I hope that you can chat with some of these gentlemen here at the table as they depart and you depart. I think that may help you. Mm-hmm.
So any informational items, updates to the commission?
Madam Chair, members of the commission, currently there's no scheduled planning commission meeting coming up that we're aware of. Trying to anticipate what the next one will be. It may be a conditional use permit for our first retail cannabis establishment. And that's going through the process. But I don't know anything else currently that is ready to come to your commission at this time.
Okay, past practices, we have generally held a planning commission meeting in Truckee, and we try to aggregate the Truckee items. Is there anything coming up?
We do have a couple of Truckee items. They're both incomplete that I'm aware of. One is an update and amendment to the Hobart Mills Comprehensive Master Plan. And then the second, both of which Kyle is working on, is a proposed sawmill and wood processing facility across the street from Hobart Mills off of Klondike Flat.
Oh, that's a new project.
Correct.
Okay. And then the rafting companies, are we due for a review?
My understanding is the rafting companies haven't started yet because potentially the flows are too high, but the rafting permitting will be, I think, next year.
Okay, thank you.
So we are going to do one in Truckee?
At some point, what we try to do is plan it so it's not in the middle of winter, that road conditions will be safe to get up there, and it always gives the Truckee commissioner joy to know he doesn't have to travel down the hill.
We will definitely plan for Truckee meetings for those items.
Okay, before the snow flies.
It depends on how the projects go forward, but yes, if possible.
Okay. I had a question about Dark Horse. Have they expired or are they still alive?
As it relates to like the clubhouse?
Yes, the clubhouse.
That is a good question. I believe at this time they're likely to have expired their long-term approval, if you will, of the comprehensive master plan. But we haven't heard anything from them. We did get a building permit for their facility they put up over their driving range recently, which may require an amendment to their use permit. We asked for more information.
You mean the structure that was red tagged?
That one, correct.
Okay. All right. Quick Quack is operating. Do you know?
Huh.
Yes, yes. Joy to the South County. Storage units, 49 are well underway after having survived a horrible winter. Any other project updates?
Not at this time. Do you have anything you can think of?
Okay.
So when you're saying the foreseeable future, just for my planning's sake, so does that mean the 2 meetings in July we should take off the books?
I would think that's pretty fair to say. Correct.
Okay, great, thanks.
And then the Idaho mine is scheduled for October in front of the Board of Supervisors.
My understanding is they've set a date for October 2nd and 3rd.
Okay. Good. So we all know the world as it is now.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be August, and now it's
Yeah.
October. And is it October because of something? I mean, I'm just trying to understand. I mean, I had heard when we had our meeting that it was going to be, we had ours in whatever month it was in April or so. And so is there a reason why it got extended all the way to October now?
Commissioner McIntyre, I don't know specifics on
Okay.
why that date was chosen.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So is there a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, meeting.